Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in what will be a series of 2 to 3 additional videos on the long-awaited Red Fleet timeline. Before I wanted to get this video and stream out of the way before we got into the timeline proper, on the basis that I've never actually dissected what Soviet naval aviation would look like in a world in which they operated Catobar carriers. Now, I don't have the knowledge to accurately dissect Soviet naval aviation by myself. Luckily, however, I know someone who does. So I'm very pleased to welcome, once again on the channel, Rex's Hangar, who I'm sure most of you are aware of, if you have any interest in the history of aviation and are around YouTube. Hi, Rex.
Hello, how are you?
Fantastic. It's so good to have you on again.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so I suppose we should start at the beginning. So, as the people may be watching may be aware, we're going to run from 1948 to 75. Now, that isn't the entire length of the timeline, but after 1975, it becomes fairly easy to imagine what sort of aircraft would be operating off the Red Fleet's carriers, as you sort of get towards a period where the fleet did actually have some designs for Catobar carriers, and they had drew up some hypothetical concepts for aircraft. And then, of course, we get into the period where the Red Fleet did actually operate a Catobar carrier, Kuznetsov, so we know roughly what sort of aircraft they planned for that, and for the Ilyanos that came after it. What we don't know is the period from 1948 to 1975, where the Red Fleet timeline has carriers where historical Russia did not. Knight, if the questions are related to what we're currently discussing, then we will field them. But we're trying to keep the questions related to the current discussion, so try and field questions that are related to what me and Rex are the point in history or the aircraft that we're currently discussing. So I suppose we start with Graf Zeppelinsky, what we know as Vladimir Lenin, and I'll just bring that up on the stream for the folks, because I actually do have a stock of images just ready for this. If it'll let me. But yeah, the first thing to ask is, I've been operating under the assumption that when the Soviets make the decision to actually proceed with the project to finish her as a straight-deck carrier, it's at that point that tenders will go out to manufacturers, I'd assume. So that's when they'd send out tenders for basically their fight. So, who do you think would be the likely people to tender for contracts at the early stage when she's straight decked? So, I personally lean towards Yakovlev and Ilyushin, basically because they have fairly rugged, easy to handle aircraft with nice wide tracked undercarriages. And of course the IL... Yeah, go on.
Yep, sorry.
Go on. No, go on.
I was going to say, I agree with that completely, although I would also trade out one of those two options as well for Sukhoi, who are often slept on as a manufacturer in this time period, even though they didn't do as much. The designs that they did produce had quite a good emphasis on strike power and ordnance. So if you're looking for a carrier-based aircraft, which is going to be more of like a carrier-based strike aircraft rather than just the dedicated fighter, some of the late war Sukhoi designs could be
what are we looking at in this period?
In some way.
What are we looking? Because I'm not very familiar with what Sukhoi were actually doing in the World War II period up till about you get to some of their jet aircraft of the 50s and 60s. I'm not actually familiar with many of their designs. What are we looking at for a Sukhoi strike aircraft, basically?
So with them, you've got. Where's the little document that I had? Sorry, I did have a document drawn up for this, and I have closed it because I'm a goober. Funnily enough,
this is how they.
um, this is going to probably get a little bit confusing because weirdly, a couple of the Sukhoi aircraft actually had their designations recycled.
Oh, whoopee.
But mainly that's only because some were paper planes only, and so the number was recycled for an actual production aircraft, or vice versa sometimes. So yeah, so there weren't many military aircraft around at that time, but if you look at the hypotheticals that were being developed, this is more so, I would say, not for your immediate post-war era, but kind of like more towards your mid-Cold War era. But an early contender, which is one that wasn't ever built in large numbers, could have been the Su-6. Only 3 were built. It was basically developed as a ground attack aircraft.
Oh, the late model Su-6 then.
So some people will know it from War Thunder as like a premium. I think it's a premium in War Thunder. A couple of people know it from that. But the reason why I think it could have been a contender, right, is the airframe design can be quite easily modified for carrier use, because the way the wing was built and the way the undercarriage, I wouldn't say it has a narrow track undercarriage, but it doesn't have a wide one. The undercarriage, the main wheels are quite inboard, and this would facilitate a wing folding mechanism to be installed quite near to where that undercarriage is, or the hinges could be basically built on the same sort of structure that goes into the undercarriage as well. So this thing could have quite a lot of its wing area folded up, like you had on some of the American aircraft that were operated on the fleet carriers, as opposed to some other designs like I forget, there was a Japanese aircraft that more so had like folding wingtips as opposed to full folding wings. So that would be a contender. But as for your suggestions with Yakovlev and IL, I would definitely agree with both.
Yeah, I'm just gonna bringing up some images for. Just gonna try to find a decent image of the Su-6. I think I got one.
There's like one that looks good, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. It basically looks
good
like
thing about it
someone
was
strapped an inline engine to an Su-2. That's what it looks like.
Well, the SU, the one I'm thinking about is the radial engined.
With the original radial.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they could have, like, I think if it's going to be for carrier operations, they would need to stick with the more reliable air-cooled radial.
Yeah, you're probably right there.
I think the Navy would insist on that, actually.
Yeah. Will we see
that being
will we see Yakovlev have to adopt radials then?
potentially? Although now that I've thought about this in hindsight, they could get away with inline because, unlike say with American fleet carriers, they're not having to operate them over such a vast oceanic network, I suppose.
Yeah, and also at this point they're discussing this is baby's first carrier aircraft. Landability, reliability, ease of handling are more important than range, weapon load, any other factors, basically. So, like, I get what you're saying, Knight, but it's like I said, the range really doesn't matter at this point. 280 miles, it's perfect for fleet exercises in the Baltic, or working in the Pacific near Vladivostok on fleet exercises.
Yeah, the range is an issue. I will agree on the Su-6. However, adjusting the tankage on the design probably wouldn't present too many compromises. And, there's always drop tanks at the end of the day. even though
Yeah.
they weren't as popular with they were not as popular with Soviet air forces at this time because the need for drop tanks wasn't really a thing because they were always operating their aerial units at the front line.
Knights
During
brought
the Second World War.
Knights brought up two aircraft: the Kochiragin OPB and the Cheyatirikov PT-1. Would likely have been what got chosen. He says. Thoughts? I've never heard of either of those aircraft.
The first one I haven't really, but the latter, the PT-1 I have. I wish I could just highlight text out of the chat so I could pull it up real quick. There we go. So yeah, that was it was a torpedo bomber.
Yeah.
Actually, I think there's a section in the book Soviet Secret Projects Bombers since 45. I think it might be mentioned, although I don't know if it falls in that or if it's just outside the purview. But yeah, no, that would definitely be a good contender.
Yeah, it's possible. Like I said, it's an option, and I think this is one of the things the Soviets were considering when they were building carriers. But I don't know if when were these aircraft considered? Because I don't know when the Cheretverikov there we go, spell it out, PT-1 was actually considered.
It was a 1945 concept, I think, 1945 to 1947.
So while it would be 3 years on the drawing board at that point, it's possible it could be resurrected. So that's not too bad.
For the PT-1, it could have been resurrected. Yeah.
The other aircraft, from what I've been able to look at, appears to be a 30s era design. So the Kochiragin OPB. But man, I've been looking for it, and there's very little I can find on the. So there's I can find the Kochiragin LSB AH, but I can't find anything on the OPB5 on the internet, and I don't have access to any information. Apparently, according to Knight, it's a dive bomber. What I would say, though, is by the time we're getting to Graf Zeppelin being considered, you're talking about she's not going to be in service till 52. They're putting tender out in 47. So work probably begins in 47. They've locked in the design basically, and they know what the deck plan's going to be by 48. So then tenders go out in 48. And even by 1948, you're seeing dive bombers rapidly withdrawn from Western carriers, replaced usually by strike aircraft. And by that I mean, attackers armed with rockets and bombs in a more traditional ground strike role. And you're seeing the torpedo bomber shift into a general purpose naval strike role. Either it is carrying increasingly capable torpedoes, or it's gradually surrendering its role on a carrier to something that's carrying guided weapons or long-range rockets.
Yeah.
So I do think the Red Fleet would probably launch Graf Zeppelin with a complement of torpedo bombers, but that would probably be the only time any carrier in the Red Fleet would carry dedicated torpedo bombing aircraft. So I think we've got... So the torpedo bomber is pretty much locked in. That's the... oh, come on. Brain. That's the PT-1. The fighter...
Yeah.
The fighter would probably be the last reliable generation of Yakovlev piston aircraft modified to carrier use, because it's simple, it works, crews know how to fly it. Converting Soviet naval aviators will be fairly easy. And of course,
I think the... Oh, sorry.
No. And for your strike aircraft, I think the choice is obvious. You take the well-proven IL-10 and you carrier it. It's rugged, reliable. You can land it on a. You could basically slam it down the deck with the force of a 10-ton bomb, and then 5 seconds later, Igor with a spanner will fix it.
Yeah.
It
No, I can agree with that.
and for ground attack and basic just harassing ships with rockets and light bombs, you can't do much better than an IL-10 as Soviet Russia. Not in
Yeah.
this period.
My only counter to the MiG fighter suggestion would probably be one of the radial engine Lavochkins.
Yeah.
I think Knight. Oh yeah, Knight's also mentioned that. Yeah, the LA.
Yeah, the LAs are also good options. I'm just basically throwing out suggestions.
Yeah. No, they're both. I would say of the two.
It's going to really come down to landing speed, I think. Which aircraft has the lower landing speed?
Yeah, that's literally what I'm trying to figure out here as well. And also which one can probably deal with the modifications for undercarriage reinforcement better.
Yeah. Folding wings at this point are an option for some of these aircraft, but I wouldn't bet on it for some of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Polycarpov I-15.
No poly.
That could work for anti-submarine. It's slow enough. It could just loiter overhead.
Honestly, as
you know,
the problem with the I-15 is that radial generates, but any of the early I-series fighters, that radial generates a heck of a lot of torque. Like that, it really can't be overstated just quite how much torque those Polycarpov radial fighters. Yeah, well, yes, Knight, the West does have jet fighters, is entirely correct. But again, Graf Zeppelin as built is, okay, we've got a carrier, let's give her an air wing of aircraft that we know our pilots can fly, that we know how to operate, that we're confident are reliable and are fairly cheap to procure, and let's see how to carry her. How are we going to use her? How's the air wing going to function?
Yeah, this is more about forming the nucleus of the future carrier fleet.
And let's push pilots through the carrier. Let's push a pilot corps through it's not at this point the Red Fleet is forming the nucleus of a carrier arm.
Yeah.
And Stalin wants a capable navy. He's not an idiot. I always say, Stalin. No, at this point, by the waning years of his life, Stalin isn't an idiot. Like, one of the reasons he doesn't adopt aircraft carriers is that he thinks they're. I think he thinks something along the lines of they're Western aligned and not really suitable for Soviet use, historically.
Yeah.
So if we're adopting a carrier, he's probably going to not want to follow at first Western doctrine of angled flight decks and jet aircraft. He's going to say, let's have a conservative Soviet carrier that is entirely Soviet-based and not adopt any of these bourgeoisie angled deck stereotypes. Because that's probably what he's going to do. But then again, it's also just, even if he does it, he says, I want jets on my carrier, they're going to say, well, we don't have carrier pilots trained to land on carriers in piston-engined aircraft, let alone with jets.
Yeah.
It's just, and the thing is, while Stalin doesn't like being told no, if you're telling him something with a logical, sound reasoning behind it that he can then go and confirm for himself, he'll accept it. And we see this on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically for the majority of her early... So when she enters service in 1952, she's carrying... Let's see, what was Graf Zeppelin's air wing meant to be? So let's have a look. Graf Zeppelin. She was supposed to carry 12 fighters, 30 dive bombers. So given that we've saved a lot of space by ripping out that horrible trolley system in the hangar,
Yeah,
and we've also got rid of
we can probably
the front cats. So
we can add a few more.
yeah, I think you're probably looking at a mixed wing of. So let me see. If I assume that given some of these won't fold, wings won't fold. Let's say I'm going to be conservative and go with the actual 1939 German proposal, but we just don't have folding wings, so that's the roughly equivalent in terms of aircraft. So you're going to have. So I think that's 42 aircraft. So it's probably going to be 12 fighter. So it's going to 42 divided 3 ways doesn't really go. 30 divided 3 ways does. So what you're probably going to have is you're going to have probably given she's one carrier, they're probably going to go with 22 fighters, 10 IL-10s, and 10 PT-1s. Basically, yes,
Yeah.
she can do strike, but we have one carrier. The Allies have, oh dear lord, look at all that. They've just commissioned the 4 Maltas.
The Soviets are basically going to be doing with her what the British and the Americans did with their first few carriers, which is basically it's basically a giant testing vessel, essentially.
Yeah, at night. Yeah, the USSR has the MiG-9 and the Yak-15. Yes, these early jet aircraft, these incredibly temperamental early jet aircraft. Trying to land a MiG-9 or a Yak-15 on a straight-deck carrier in the Baltic or the Northern Oceans, having had no experience before, I wouldn't want to do that.
The Graf Zeppelins had a catapult removed, which means you literally cannot launch a MiG-9 off the deck of Graf Zeppelin. Its takeoff run is simply too long. You need cats.
And we've removed them because of how much trouble they were. So it's why she's operating piston-engined aircraft. Again, you're trying to run before the Red Fleet can walk night. I mean, at this point they're still stumbling. They're not really properly walking with their carriers yet. She's only just entered commission. Like, just for reference, in this straight deck form with piston-engined aircraft, she spends a good 8 years just running exercises, churning pilots through programs, building a corps of officers and men, building a corps of deck crew. Like, just 8 years churning through experience, operating aircraft, building doctrine.
And also during this time, probably allowing the Soviet fleet the time to decide, is this something we need to invest more in, or is this carrier thing just a fad that we're not actually going to push through long term?
Like, there's furious debate after the death of Stalin. Because, like, the Red Fleet by this point has all of they have Sovietsky Soyuz, they have the 6 Stalingrads, and they have Graf Zeppelin. And there's furious debate about whether or not they're going to retain this whole big Red Fleet, or if what they've got is basically what they're going to stick with. So that's what's happening during those 8 years. Basically, Graf Zeppelin's crew are running her ragged to try and prove that they deserve to exist. This nascent Red Fleet air arm deserves to exist. Look what we can do with our carrier. Look what we could do if you give us a better carrier. You know, things like that.
They need to justify their existence first.
Yeah.
On the balance sheet, basically.
And I mean, there's a lot of work she does clandestinely as well. So, for example, during the Korean War, she the last years of the Korean War, she makes clandestine runs to Korea with Sovietsky Soyuz, and does some funky shenanigans. And again, it all fits into how they're training their doctrine up.
Yeah.
So basically, the next real change is when we get to what's the word? When we get to the
Refit?
Yes, thank you. Brain didn't quite work there for a second. After
we got there in the end.
Yeah. So the next thing is really when things really do start to get interesting. So this early bit, it's fairly straightforward. Um, it's it's straight wing piston engined aircraft, giving the Soviets experience in operations and doctrine.
Yeah.
What comes next is more interesting. This is Graf Zeppelin in a more detailed view as she is after her refit. She emerges from this in 1962. A lot of the Red Fleet timeline's heavy units go in for refit during the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically because Khrushchev decides not, if it doesn't carry a missile as a heavy unit, it's not worth it, then what's the point of a straight deck carrier that can't operate jets? So all of the Red Fleet units go in for their rebuild. Yes, Montana, her real name is Vladimir Lenin. We just call her Graf Zeppelinski because it's, yeah, it's,
Comical.
yeah. So this is Graf Zeppelin in her rebuilt form. You'll notice not only does she have catapults, blast deflectors, and proper markings, she's lost her forward lift. She's gained spot markers for helicopters, angled flight deck, fully enclosed weather bow now, with 2 steam cats. And then a 3rd steam cat along the flight deck. She's got a deck edge lift. In fact, what I'm just going to do is I'm actually just going to shrink that down a bit, and I'm going to get the other image of her as well, just so it can be compared side by side. And by that I mean there's an image of her from the rear, which is actually really... Oops. Nearly someone tried to make a getaway. There we go. So let me just because you can see quite clearly some of the rear the work that's been done to her rear, including one of the key features that they've adopted from the West, which is actually kind of vital for sortie rates and fairly important for some of her operations. You'll notice she has a... Oh, good lord.
Oh no.
She has a deck edge lift. So,
very important piece of kit to have.
And obviously an instrument landing system as well. I mean, Graf Zeppelin had numerous problems, Knight. There was Luftwaffe interference, there were her incredibly temperamental high-pressure engines, that catapult system. Yeah, but a lot of them do stem from lack of carrier experience. Obviously, what I will say is that she does retain her temperamental engines when she's completed, operated and maintained by some coerced, shall we say, German engineers. Of course, during her rebuild, they basically gut her down to the frames and rebuild her.
Yeah.
Because again, they're still not quite sure if carriers is something they want to work with, but Khrushchev says, you know what, I'll let you build a Catobar carrier and show me what you can do. I don't want to build a new hull, but I'll let you gut Graf Zeppelin down to the frames and rework her. And so that's what they do. She's technically the same ship, but radically different. She's got new, more reliable Russian machinery, completely different armament fit, reworking of the hangars, some of the lifts. It is probably more expensive than building a new ship, but again, they don't want to commit to a new design without the lessons of operating a Catobar carrier rebuild.
Yeah.
So, given that it's 1962 by this point, again, one of the things that we're still in the opting for maturity rather than modernity when it comes to the Red Fleet's carriers. The only exception to this is the Kamov helicopters she carries for anti-submarine work, because it's obvious she's a Russian carrier. Kamov exists. It's really a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Kamov 25s, I think, when she re-entered service in 1962. The aircraft she's depicted with here are not final designs. I personally lean towards MiG-17 and MiG-15, basically down to maturity of design. And the reason I say this is not so much because of landing speed, not so much because of foldable wings, it's the ability of those older, more mature aircraft to be more easily rendered spray and cold soak resistant, which is vital for a carrier operating in the North Atlantic and in the Baltic.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They might not be equivalent to some of the Western aircraft, but they will be able to operate and fly in any weather. You might see MiG-19 considered. But MiG-19 by 1962 is... Oh no, MiG-19 is actually... Oh wow, MiG-19's older than I thought.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's surprisingly old, yes.
Yeah, so honestly...
The 50s.
Yeah, so honestly, yeah, so... Never mind, MiG-19 is probably what you're looking at, which gives you basic capability to use early air-to-air missiles. It gives you decent strike capability because it's not got a terrible bomb load. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's not terrible.
Yeah.
It's fairly rugged. And I think it'll be fairly easy to convert pilots to. Again, you're probably looking at I would say with the MiG-19 being in, I might revise my statement that I made privately to Rex a while ago. I may actually adopt a MiG-15 variant as a naval strike aircraft. Basically because the MiG-19 is where you start to see this brief trend where the MiGs basically configure more towards air-to-air engagements. The MiG-15 and the MiG-17 can be perfectly capable bomb trucks, but the MiG-19... You know what I mean, don't you, Rex? It has that... You lose some of the pylon capacity that you had with the MiG-17 and MiG-19. Sorry, MiG-17 and MiG-15.
Yeah. I think the only challenge... I think the biggest challenge that we're gonna face with any of the design choices, and it's a challenge that we saw with rapid design conversions during World War II, and that is navalizing these designs. Like, performance-wise, they could work. Like, the MiG-15 stall speed is low enough that carrier operations just about work. The biggest challenge for the MiG-15 and the MiG-19 is reinforcing the airframe to cope with the rigors of carrier launching and landing, particularly the landing, because that's going to require some fairly hefty reinforcement of the landing gear, depending on the pilots that are going to be using it. Because if you compare videos of Air Force aircraft and Navy aircraft and how they land, the landing gears have a very different experience. Because when you've got, a big, mile or plus long runway, you can afford to be a lot more gentle with your landing. But when you've got a carrier deck, you kind of just need to slam that ass down and pray that the arrestor hook catches, which subjects the landing gear to a ridiculous amount of force.
I would point out, Knight, yes, you say the West has F4 Phantoms in 1962, and yes, the West does have F4 Phantoms, but we see that it's not as close a cut thing as you think. A decent MiG-19 pilot can, if he's smart, kill an F4. And if a MiG-19 with missiles, with infrared missiles, which you can feasibly mount on a MiG-19, especially a navalized version, tangles with something that's not an F4. Let's say, for example, it encounters something like a Crusader, or God forbid, it encounters some of the British carrier aircraft of the time. My money may... Well, with the Crusader, it's basically a 50-50 which pilot's better. But against some of the British carrier aircraft at the time, which are not exactly dogfighters and more lob a missile at ye from range,
Yeah.
I probably give my money to the MiG-19 navalized version.
Yeah.
It's not...
I would agree.
Yeah, it's not all about... Yeah, the West is ahead, quote-unquote. But... no, we're not forgetting the Montreux Convention. Red Fleet carriers, as a rule, are built in the Baltic. Ukraine builds the missile cruisers, it builds some of the Stalingrads, but there's a determined effort by Stalin to build capacity in Baltic and Pacific shipyards. Mainly Baltic, because that's nearest to the heavy industry. To get around that annoying Montreux Convention. So Graf Zeppelin is finished in the Baltic. The carriers are... or all future carriers are built in the Baltic. Knight, I feel like that's a bit of a gross oversimplification of the situation in Vietnam. You want to have a crack at that one, Rex, quickly? I feel like that's a little bit oversimplifying the situation in Vietnam there.
Look, in some of the cases of the shootdowns, and look, I will say Vietnam is not my area of expertise, but I do have a fair amount of books on it now. My area of expertise is definitely World War II and before.
Oh yeah.
Or very modern stuff. Weirdly, don't ask me why, but there's just this like 40-year gap in my knowledge. Like I'm really into all the modern stuff, but from what I know and from people that I speak to, and I've actually spoken to a couple of people who flew in Vietnam. It was a case of sometimes it was poor training. It was sometimes situational advantage in terms of how the two aircraft met in combat. I would say another big influence was also a lack of appreciation, and this is something that I had from someone who didn't fly in Phantoms, but he's the granddad of someone in my Discord, and he was a mechanic on the deck of one of the carriers. And he said in conversations with an old war buddy, one of the things that kind of tripped them up was they underestimated the Soviet pilots, because some of them just assumed, American pilots must automatically be better. And, cockiness can get you killed if you don't look after it. In some situations, the F-14 is the F-4 is absolutely going to club the MiG-19, and I'm not disputing that at all. But I would say if they were to come together in other alternate conflicts and things like that, I don't think the MiG-19 would be completely clobbered. It would definitely be the underdog in the situation, especially if you're not looking at it from a dogfighting perspective. If you're looking at it from a carrier and power projection perspective, the F4 wins hands down, just because it's just that much more versatile. The payload capacity is bonkers. But if you're looking purely from an aerial combat perspective, there can definitely be some scenes where the MiG-19 is the upsetter, especially if the MiG-19 is being sent in the cap role to deal with F4s and other strike aircraft that are carrying a lot of ordnance and are therefore running in different flight profiles.
Yeah,
and yes, to be fair, the US did have absolutely dogshit missiles at the time.
Yeah,
but the
go on.
I was going to say it was also because most of the early missiles were designed to take on bombers. So I think in a lot of these dogfighting situations, they probably wouldn't really be considered anywhere. I think we're still in the age of the final years of the true gunfighting. air combat in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And in that particular case, given where we are, the Big 19 is not perfect, but against if it doesn't run into a US carrier, if it runs into, say, one of the French carriers, or it runs into a British carrier, its fighters are going to have a decent chance. It's going to be at least an even fight. And bear
Yeah,
bear in mind,
British especially.
yeah, and bear in mind, the MiG 19 is only the first jet fighter aircraft that the VKS is, sorry, the Soviet Naval Air Arm is adopting.
Yeah.
Now, I had considered, resurrecting the IL-40 as a carrier-based aircraft, but it's just a bit too big. It was cancelled in 1955. They do keep bringing it back. There's the IL-40T torpedo bomber, but again, it sort of feels. I mean, it's a chunky aircraft, the IL-40. It's, and I feel like it's almost too much aircraft for carrier. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just that little bit too big, and it's a little bit.
Yeah, I think the detractor is going to be the size.
Yeah, it's a heckin' chonker of an aircraft. If I'm allowed to get away with saying that on my own.
Again, the design bureau though could be approached by the Navy to, take the concept and apply it to a naval design. But again, because we're looking at designs that were actually drawn up, that's a story for another day.
Yeah. Personally, I think you are, because we're well past the point when torpedo bombing or dive bombing are really valid anti-ship strategies against an actual warship. Because unless that warship is monumentally stupid, you're going to be locked up by early missiles and extremely accurate guns and knocked out of the sky.
Yes.
Now, the Vietnamese had some luck doing level bombing against ships in Vietnam, but that was against US World War II era destroyers with fast jets, and even then they had to get very, very lucky to get through the hail of 5-inch proximity fuse flak.
Yeah.
If you try it, if a modern Soviet carrier group was to attack a force with modern US destroyers or British frigates or British destroyers in this period in the 60s, with dive and torpedo bombers, first of all, the carrier aircraft involved, the fighters, are just going to laugh hysterically while gunning you down. And secondly, even if you somehow pierce through, if the early anti-aircraft missiles don't get you, and they probably will, some of the things the US is fielding at this point are absolutely terrifying weapons, just in terms of what they actually are. Telegraph pole of Mach 3 be upon ye. But you've also got the thought of a bunch of 54 caliber 5-inch guns blazing away at you, like putting rounds.
You're not going to have a good time.
No,
you're not going to have a good time.
Yes,
so that's the fighter complement.
Yes, you will see other carriers. Well, that at first. We will have a discussion on what replaces these when we talk about Ukraine in a minute. But first things first, we need to talk about. So for helicopters, for anti-submarine work, it's easy. KA-25. It's in service. It's available. It's bloody good.
Done.
It's really not that hard. You may notice in the images an IL-28 landing on the deck. That's not something that we consider a viable carrier aircraft, as in we being the Red Fleet Timeline crew. It's depicted here as sort of a size comparison for how big Graf Zeppelin's deck is after her rebuild. You're probably looking at Graf Zeppelin being the first ship where the Russians contemplate the idea of an onboard delivery aircraft. They'll probably, honestly, for my money, you're probably looking at the old reliable AN-2 biplane. I mean, you can't go wrong with it. You don't even need to use the catapults, and it can carry a decent load. Just get an AN-2. Probably, get an AN-2, put a turboprop in it to increase its power and load carrying capacity, and then you've got a fairly simple, effective onboard delivery system. You probably won't use it to bring additional weapons aboard, but food, medical supplies, books, reading material. Like, yeah, an AN2 will do that easily.
Mm.
Although that probably won't last forever. It'll probably be replaced by something else later on. So strike aircraft. Like I said, I leaned.
Yaha.
I used to say that the Red Fleet would adopt a single aircraft policy, but given that we've adopted the MiG-19, we now need some form of strike capability. And personally, I would prefer to keep something like the MiG-17, MiG-15, because that means you've got a jet aircraft, you can carry basic anti-ground missiles, be those small anti-ship or more likely very, very basic missiles. And failing that, you've got rocket attack and bomb attack. But with a jet aircraft, you can come in low and fast. You can, especially against some ships of the era, you can come in low, pop up, deliver your ordnance, and then be away. Especially if you've got air cover.
Mm.
But I noticed you had a glint in your eye there. I can see by the smirk. So I assume you've got something in mind.
Yeah. So as a strike aircraft suggestion, I'm going to send you some images via Discord because I should have sent them to you before. But I would be suggesting another Sukhoi design, which is the T-58 VD, but also the T-58M, which were two sort of like experimental designs. The former being an offshoot of the latter.
Okay.
Now the VD was purely designed as a flying laboratory for the program of creating a STOL aircraft in the bombing/strike role, which led to design studies for something that then became known as the T-58M. So I've sent you I'll send you an image of the T-58M as well, which you can post on the stream if you like.
I'm going to do exactly that.
Excellent. Yeah, so that was the VD that I've sent you. And this one is the M. But basically, I'm going for these because they're STOL for one. The T-58M was designed as an upscaled version of the VD, but the VD design as well was also drawn up with strike capabilities in mind. Regardless of which one you go for, they have the inner wing pylons for KH-24s, which gives them good strike capability.
When are these aircraft available? And they seem pretty big.
So the VD was proposed in 60?
And when was this first
Might be
flight?
wrong. Let me pull this up.
Because she returns to service in 62 and they're going to want to have an air wing ready for her when she comes back out of the yard.
Oh, you see, that's when we just crack out the whip. So... Oh no, she did not fly until after that.
It does seem like an awful lot of jet. It seems fairly chunky. And also with that delta wing, I'm just landing that on a carrier. I suppose you could make it. I mean, the F4 Phantom sat there looking at.
I mean, it's designed. It's STOL designed. It's designed for short takeoff runs.
Short, yeah, and I suppose it can do arrested recovery.
Yes, exactly.
Which is
catapult assisted takeoff.
Yeah, okay.
Its landing speed is slower than the Phantoms.
Okay, all right, that's actually fairly decent.
Its landing speed is 225 kph.
Honestly, with delta wings that small, I don't think you really need folding wings.
Yeah. No, no, you don't. That's why I'm also suggesting it because that is good. As for its dimensions, wingspan, it's small. It's 8.6 meter wingspan.
Wow, that's
Length
tiny.
is length is 22 meters and the height is 5. It is not big. It is not a big plane.
Holy smoke.
That is the original one. That's the T-58. That's the VD. The M I think is something like 20% bigger, but still that isn't like a huge plane.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And I mean, and also like, it eventually evolved into, I mean, these were design studies that were ultimately put aside. They eventually evolved into the sweep wing Su-24, which was, designed in response to the F-111.
Yeah.
But
that is getting a little bit towards the
no,
that's big.
Exactly. But but in its original thing, the VD and the T-58M has the size that will make it suitable for a carrier.
Longevity as well. It can be a fairly
longevity.
It can be a fairly long-lived design with the fleet.
The M would also have a crew of 2.
Yeah.
As opposed to the VD, which only had a single cockpit. Admittedly, that's because it was a research lab, but I can't see any evidence in sources that I've got that would suggest that one would have a second cockpit added on. It looks like it was designed as a one-person craft in the beginning, but the M was designed with a tandem cockpit at the very beginning.
Yep.
Which meant that the pilot can just worry about piloting.
And then you've got
weapons behind him dealt with. Yeah, weapons officer. Yeah.
Which, given the complexities of some of the anti-ship missiles of the era, you really do need.
Absolutely necessary. Yeah, I could not imagine doing that in a single-seater.
Yeah.
It would be unfun.
Yeah. To be fair,
it's a pretty niche suggestion.
It's not a bad one though.
Like they're just like I've gone through all my Soviet like concept aircraft books and stuff, like all the ones by Yefim Gordon and everything, and there really just aren't that many that were drawn up for this role because this role didn't exist.
Yeah, so basically, this is
so I'm kind of clutching at straws. Yeah.
This is why Rex being here is incredibly vital because I wouldn't have even known where to start to look.
Yeah.
For this aircraft, but he found it.
Yeah.
Su-24K,
and
yeah, the Su-24K. Yes, it was because it was ridiculously heavy. I wouldn't want to operate an Su-24 from a carrier, even an American nuke carrier at this period. I would just be like, no, please stop. Why are you doing this?
Yes, no.
There's a reason why the A5 Vigilante had a very, very short service life.
Yes.
It was almost too much aircraft, even for the US Navy.
Yep. God help you if there was ever a landing accident.
Yeah.
Oof.
So the fleet basically sticks as so you've got gravity returns. You've got a mix of A&2 is your onboard delivery. You've got the So what would this thing's designation be if it entered service? So what was the design bureau that created
Sukhoi.
it? So this would be SU. What would you call it?
SU-20 something, I guess it would be, because the Su-24 came after it.
Yeah, so it would be something. It would be SU-18, I guess, K, or something like that.
Yeah. Something like that, yeah.
Again, we can't know the exact designation because it was never adopted or even considered. So you got MiG-19K, Su-18K. You're basically looking at these. So see, we had 42 aircraft when they were piston-engined aircraft. I'm probably thinking with this drop, you're looking at 15 aircraft each with space for 4 to 5 helicopters. So 15 MiG-19s, 15 Su-18Ks, and 5 Camel helicopters. with only the MiGs being able to use the centerline lift, and the unfortunately the Su-18s having to use the deck edge.
Mm.
Next we come to something a little bit exciting. So, we've got to discuss the follow-on to Graf Zeppelin, and the only other carrier we will... Well, not the only other carrier, but the main other carrier we're discussing. So, when Graf Zeppelin's rebuild is judged to be a success, and she re-enters the fleet, basically in the months afterwards, they're like, okay, this is not only is the rebuild succeeded, the Catobar is useful, and with the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis still fresh on Soviet minds, aka the lack of the heavy units, the inability to posture successfully against the US near Cuba with actual surface units of the Red Fleet, they decide they want a second carrier. Again, it's still a partial test bed, but they want a keel-up design. They decide they're going to aim for a similar displacement to Graf Zeppelin, because again, it's the size of carrier they're familiar operating. It means they can keep crewing requirements somewhat similar. She's often referred to, but not always, as Graf Zeppelin's half-sister, the carrier Ukraine. That's her on the right. You'll notice she's still a conventional carrier. She retains the 3 catapult setup, but she's now only got deck edge lifts, and she's much better laid out in terms of the angle of her flight deck, the length of her steam catapults. Like I say, similar displacement, but a much, much more capable carrier.
And the deck is a little bit greener.
Yes, it is a little bit greener.
Yep.
So what you've basically got is she commissions into the Red Fleet, if I consult my timeline. She commissions into the Red Fleet in 19... So when does... So she's laid down in 1962. 1966. Yeah, so she commissions in 66. And she basically spends a good chunk of her career as the more capable carrier that's a better sea boat in the Pacific. That's basically where she's based. It's basically because when you're designing a conventional carrier around this size, and you're building something from the keel up, and you're building it to follow Graf Zeppelin, and we haven't quite gotten to the era where the doctrine of anti-ship missiles in Russian carriers... Well, to be fair, in the Red Fleet timeline, that doesn't really take off at all. So... there's no need for that very weird angled flight deck that Russian carriers armed with missiles tend to have. So 1966 is basically when you see the... so the Su-18K remains, but, I mean, it's fairly obvious what replaces the MiG-19. Since we know what Russian doctrine and carrier aircraft... This is one of the few things we do know. Basically, about a year or two after the Ukraine enters service, she exchanges her MiG-19s for MiG-29Ks. Because it's variable geometry, multi-role aircraft, very controllable at low speed, good rough field capability. I think... It basically brings the Red Fleet's fighter wings up to parity with the West by the mid-60s in terms of fighters. if you'd like, would you mind talking about the MiG-23 for a little bit about how it might be used on a carrier? I need to
So
very
when
back
they
in a
actually
tick.
work, they could they could be useful. If we disregard the MiG-23's absolutely woeful reputation for being a mechanic's nightmare, driving them to drink even more vodka than they already were drinking, it could be quite a useful aircraft to have. Again, it's gonna suffer from the same issue that a lot of the other designs we've looked at tonight suffer from, and that's the fact is you're gonna have to navalize it, because obviously, in reality, I don't think it was ever looked at for carrier operations. I could be mistaken. My knowledge on the MiG-23 is not complete. Like I'd say one of my biggest knowledge gaps as a budding aviation historian would definitely be the Cold War Soviet stuff, particularly stuff after 1959, 1960-ish. I just don't have much on that. But
yeah. It was just a quick little intro, basically. Not so much a detailed diatribe, more of a here's a little Cliff Notes history. The reason that the MiG-29 is the obvious choice is fairly simple. It's about the right size. We know it has good long-term capability. It gives the Red Fleet nuclear strike capability because, again, they can carry single nuclear freefall bombs under the fuselage, which is kind of useful to the Red Fleet in it gives their carriers nuclear posture capability as well as their submarines. So NATO now has to think twice. You're probably going to see an engine replacement, given that it's because
broken half the time.
Yes, and also it can only last.
It is the MiG-23 we're talking about.
Yeah, this is one of the like the Red Fleet is one of the only areas where you might see the Russians drop their insistence on engine hours, being low. Like 150 hours before being replaced is not really acceptable for a carrier aircraft. And
it's nothing.
And unlike with some of their other designs, they're not exporting their carrier aircraft. So that desire to have the customers tied to, them with foreign currency buying replacement engines, it doesn't really apply here.
Yeah.
For the West, Soviets having parity will never be allowed to happen. It's...
No, he's got a point.
Yeah. I mean, of course,
the moment the Yanks get wind that they're working on like navalized version of these things, they're just going to straight up accelerate any naval fighter development is going to get given all of the budget. Mind you, they might. I say that though, but the Americans are going to look at the Soviets and their two aircraft carriers and go, "Oh, baby."
And then quietly
laughs in, giant carrier fleet.
And then of course they're going to have kittens when in 1966 they lay down their first 4 conventional supercarriers.
Exactly.
Because that's when so 1968 is when those happened. They're the Kievs, not to be confused with our timeline's Kievs. Entirely different kettles of fish. But I will show them off, but they're a little bit outside the scope of what we're discussing. So you've basically got the MiG-29 and the Su-18 basically soldering on, obviously, going through that lovely thing that happens to carrier aircraft of variantitis, A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
Yep.
Basically because we've got something that works, and we're not gonna take a chance on something that we don't really need, unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to point out is you do still see the Yak-38 developed. Partially out of a desire to have a VTOL aircraft because the West have VTOL aircraft, so, anything you can do, I can do better. And
Yep.
also partially because the Red Fleet does actually have a helicopter operator. So I'm sure you're aware of the Moskvas that exist. Yeah, those
Mm.
don't exist here. We don't do that here. Um, but the Red Fleet does have a platform that operates significant numbers of rotary wing and VTOL assets.
Mm.
And that is the, if I can find it, the Stalingrads after their rebuild. They retain most of their gun armament and their missile armament, but they lose their aft turret and a good chunk of their rear superstructure. And what you're left with is a aircraft. Here we go. Found it. What you're left with is a platform that. So bear in mind, the flight deck is underneath the flight deck. So the hangar's underneath the flight deck. So you've got those two structures in the middle are lifts. And there's also so you don't do maintenance in the flight deck. If a helicopter needs maintenance, it's brought up and then wheeled into that. You see that little hangar superstructure forward? That's where if an aircraft needs to be disassembled, it happens there. But general maintenance happens in the flight deck under the helicopter launch platform.
God, if that thing's ever in a following sea, the crew are gonna love that.
Yeah, that little opening, that's closed off fairly sharpish in about 1966.
Okay, I was gonna say
This is just as originally completed.
Oh.
So again, because the Stalingrads, all six of them, they're usually leading a surface action group all the time. They're like, if the Soviets want to make a point, a Stalingrad shows up with a surface action group. And it's very handy, like, in cases where they're not expecting much trouble, or they have destroyers with hangars aboard, what they'll usually do is the Stalingrads will land, as in land ashore, their Ka-27s and 25s, and they'll put Yak-38s aboard.
Yeah.
So let's say if the Russians are helping the MPLA in Angola, you'd have Yak-38s doing naval strike. Doing ground attack missions, operating from the Stalingrad as sort of a quasi-carrier.
Yeah.
It just gives the Red Fleet flexibility without having to deploy what are at this point two very, very valuable assets.
It also gives them power projection on a budget.
Yeah, exactly, which is what they need right now, because we're not quite at the mid-70s where the funding gates really do crash open for the Red Fleet in a major way.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's just a little. So yeah, the Yak-38 does still exist, but you don't see anything like the Yak-141 because air superiority work is being handled by MiG-23s, and you might see an improved VTOL strike aircraft following the Yak-38, but you're not going to see something like the Yak-141.
So would you see something maybe like the unbuilt Yak-39?
Probably, yeah.
Which was Mind
Night.
you, that was a later project though.
Yeah, Night. Yes, we know what the Red Fleet was planning in the 1950s for carriers. Yeah, but they don't get round to building a replacement for Graf Zeppelin until 1962. So we're well past the 50s. So Ukraine is a carrier laid down in 63, commissioned in 66. So she's well past that period when we have design studies for Red Fleet carriers. And also, this is somewhat artistic license by Sea Dodders. She may not have looked exactly like that in a hypothetical world where she existed. So you've basically got Ukraine and Graf Zeppelin operating these aircraft. Of course, the Graf Zeppelin has a hangar height limit that Ukraine does not, even after the full rebuild where they gutted her. there's only so much you can really do to improve hangar height. Really. So a lot of the aircraft we're talking about have to have fold-over tails, or undercarriages that can sort of let them drop down a bit to fit on Graf Zeppelin. That's not really a problem for Ukraine, however. And the Red Fleet is willing to accept these compromises with their aircraft because, well, they only have 2 carriers and they need their fleet to be able to operate from both of their carriers. So yes, that's that. You've got the obviously the 2 Russian carriers do take tours off Vietnam. They don't engage in direct combat, but wherever there are US carriers operating off Vietnam, you'll usually find either a service action group or one of the 2 Russian carriers shadowing them very, very closely. Now, I know I said this was about Russian aircraft and aircraft carriers.
Oh no.
But we do have a momentary aside here. Because there's one other power that operates carriers that doesn't operate carriers historically that we need to talk about.
Albernia?
That's
the memes will keep memeing.
I suppose I have to accept that one on face value. But no, not Albonia. What we're actually talking about is Japan. With the rise of Russian power in the Pacific and the increasing threat of the US having to basically keep an eye on multiple oceans now where the Russians have service action groups and keep an eye on Russia's 2 carriers and the whole thing that they're having to deal with here. There's
America would give some lineage. Yeah, actually.
Yeah, I
see where you're going with
this.
There's
a desire to bulk up the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. Now, of course, China is still historical. They're not really in a position to join the big power. The big power naval club.
Especially if the Chinese-Soviet rift still happens,
which it probably
where they're no longer which they're no longer best buddies for quite a considerable period. So yeah.
Let me see. Yes. So, but what happens is actually somewhat interesting. So, the Japanese do get a carrier. But the US want to give them something that they're absolutely 100% super confident cannot, under any circumstances, be a threat to them. As in it's...
Do they refloat the Yamato?
No. The refloating bit's gone. So they build them a heavy surface combatant in the form of a... sort of a B-65 knockoff that they build themselves, then give to Japan. But the carrier, the carrier is something that I'm gonna put the picture up, and I'm gonna see how long it takes people to twig on.
All right, I've got to wait for like the 15-second delay on stream.
Yep. So behold, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force ship, Unryu. Can anybody guess? Bear in mind, she's taken in hand for a refit in the US in the late 50s. Before she would otherwise have been scrapped. And is then handed over to Japan after that rebuild, which is paid for in full by the... Yes, it is CV6.
It is. I knew it. Oh.
It is CV6.
Japanese veterans of Guadalcanal would be absolutely appalled.
Oh yeah, they would, but it's also a very clear, but it's also a very clear statement.
It's a message.
Yeah,
it's a there is some subliminal read between the lines shit going on here.
That's exactly right. So she's not scrapped in the Red Fleet timeline. She's given to Japan. She's made to at least be somewhat capable. She's not the biggest ship in the world, but she's still given a full rebuild to, new engines.
What software did he use to make this?
Oh, this is all. Well, I didn't make it. This is all Sea Dodders.
Oh, okay.
Who's done this? But he's done it in naval art, which is he's done a fantastic job. Can I just say?
Yeah.
He really has. But yeah, so the thing is now, I would like to say that they go with US aircraft only, but I can see the Mitsubishi salesman leaning in, from the side, going, "We've just restarted our aircraft production lines with US licenses. I'm sure we can come up with something for you."
02 Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah. So, yeah. So
yeah, that would be an interesting development. The rebirth of the Japanese carrier fleet starts with Enterprise.
Yeah. Knight, by 1958, by the time the US considered doing this, there are no Japanese carriers left. The US don't consider doing this till 1958. And to be fair to them, the Japanese Navy by that point has no large units, and they're not in a position to build a carrier. So, yeah, because most of the Japanese...
Give them one of the spares,
Yeah. That's basically where you are. It's one of the reasons why... Basically, Enterprise was in the right place at the right time with the right level of capability. It gives the Japanese an ability to... A, prove they can be trusted with a carrier. B, redevelop carrier skills. And C, it also preserves USS Enterprise in the timeline, so that makes me happy.
Yeah.
And I will point out, this isn't the US being generous. The Japanese pay for the privilege of having Enterprise given a full rebuild. Like, it's not a... The problem the problem is, Knight, is that, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but by the 50s and 60s, a light fleet carrier you can't operate jet aircraft off a Saipan or an Independence, and they don't have the hull stability to be angled flight decked and catapulted. It's not like the British light fleet carriers, where you've got that level of stability, displacement to work with.
Mm.
Things like Enterprise, the light fleets, they're about the smallest existing carriers you can convert to operate. Why not give them an Essex? Again, it's all about capability. An Essex could be converted into a carrier that could give the Japanese... capability that the US it would give them more capability. Yeah, it would give them more capability. Like, you can operate jet aircraft from Enterprise, but things like Skyhawk, Crusader, so high thrust, low drag, but lighter aircraft only, and things like Tracker rather than Sentry. You can't operate F4 Phantom. You can't operate the heavier strike aircraft. Again, it's all about, yes, we want Japan to have this capability, but we still don't quite trust you enough to... Yeah. Knight, like I said, the light fleet carriers are a size again above Independences and Saipans. And they're purpose-built carrier hull from the keel up. The Clevelands and Saipans, even though the Saipans are purpose-built, are still cruiser hull turned into carrier. Whereas the
Yeah.
light fleets are carrier keel up, carrier stylings. I mean, the difference in displacement just speaks for itself. The Saipan class carriers displace around 14,000 tons standard. A light fleet carrier like the Centaurs, they displace 22,000 tons standard. Like, that's a difference of that is a massive difference. Like, with the light fleets, you're basically talking about, yes, they're light fleet carriers, but in the Washington Naval Treaty period, they would have just been called full-size carriers.
Yes.
It's
quite large.
It's an entirely different kettle of fish. I mean, even when Spain was just operating Harriers from them, they had difficulties. Because of just how small the Saipans actually were. Anyway,
yeah, like I'm looking up them now because I know nothing about them, but oh yeah, they're babies. They're tiny.
Yeah, but yeah. So the thing is, Enterprise is basically in that same ballpark of displacement as a light fleet. Is what makes it perfect for it. But anyway, so I think you're probably looking at US aircraft first and foremost. So you're probably looking at something like, so again, Crusaders and Skyhawks are what really springs to mind. So lighter aircraft, good thrust-to-weight ratio, easy to land, capable of being stored in her hangars.
Definitely the Skyhawks, I would say, at the two. Like, if they had to give them... I mean, they would probably give them both, but I would definitely say the Skyhawk would be...
yeah.
Would be a really good fit.
Yeah, I mean, we see that Skyhawks can operate from carriers slightly smaller than Enterprise, in the form of the Cinco de Mayo. And of course, Japan does get other carriers later down the line, but that's not really the subject of discussion here. But yeah, do people want to see quickly before we move on, and we just talk about some of the domestic? I think domestic Japan. I think you better bet your bottom dollar that Mitsubishi will go away and come up with a light jet fighter for use on the carrier. You know, basically, yeah. No, seriously, it would basically just be take an A4 Skyhawk or something, or a similar sized airframe, make it slightly more aerodynamic, and give it the ability to carry 4 AM9s. Just a light point defense fleet fighter, but designed to operate from Enterprise and her limited. Because she doesn't have deck edge. She only has centerline lifts. So you've got that.
Okay, yeah,
you've got that limitation to work around as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's basically the size of it. I think Mitsubishi will come up with some form of light fighter. What form that will take, it's hard to say. But that is about the long and short of it. What replaces the Tupolev Tu-91? What is the Tupolev Tu-91?
Oh, the boot.
I don't know if... So, yeah, I suppose the boot would be operated as the airborne early warning aircraft. They were part of Long Range Strike, but they don't think they wouldn't be able to operate from Graf Zeppelin until after her rebuild. By which point they probably would they wouldn't be viewed as a strike asset. They'd be viewed as a airborne early warning asset. So the design would probably be kept warm in the 5 years after Graf Zeppelin was finished in '55.
I do love how all of the AEW aircraft of that era were, and I'm going to offend some people with this, universally fugly.
Yeah, brick. Yes, we
like
are brick.
The Seamew, the
Tracker,
the Gannet,
the Tracker.
It's like they were like the absolute definition of function over form, which fair enough. But it's just, I just find it funny how like those specific sets of mission requirements leads to an airframe that, at first glance, you're like, "Why is this thing airborne? Why?"
Yeah, you are
When in
probably
fact it was actually perfectly usable.
yeah, you are probably looking at a replacement though by the time Ukraine enters service. Let me just switch the picture back to her quickly. But yeah, you are looking at a replacement probably. So, are there any airframes that the Russians can use in the mid to late 60s? Like they're about the right
AEW?
size. Yeah, for an AW platform, something akin to the. So let me see. Let me just see a Hawkeye.
I mean, a few things could be modified.
So yeah, it would be the Russian equivalent of the E1 Tracer.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking what will be that equivalent in the.
I mean, if there isn't one that exists, I reckon the manufacturer that could be shoulder tapped to have it developed would probably be Beriev.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's not a bad shout.
I think Beriev would be tipped to develop that,
Yeah,
considering they did exclusively naval stuff more or less in this period.
yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Um, which probably raises the problem of the Soviet AW platform can probably operate from Ukraine. I think Graf Zeppelin's going to have real problems.
Oh, I don't think it's going to happen, personally.
Yeah, I think this is where Graf Zeppelin's age really starts coming back to bite her in the tail. She's probably
Yeah.
stuck with the Tu-91s until she's basically phased out into the reserves in the 70s, which basically puts her in Baltic and North Sea. Basically, the Baltic is the worst deployment for a Russian carrier.
Oh,
Northern Fleet is the.
Beriev. Sorry, carry on. But I found something that could be used potentially as um the template,
Oh yeah.
which was the Beriev BE-30/BE-32, which was developed as a regional airliner slash utility transport, as a shoulder-mounted twin engine frame.
Oh,
That could be.
ooh,
That's got.
yeah.
It's got the right. It's got the right size and dimensions. I mean, with a
Two,
lot of tinkering with the drawing board.
yeah, two turboprops. It's about the right. Yeah, no, that. Hang on, I'll just bring that up for the audience.
It's not the fast. It's not the fastest bird out there.
It doesn't have to be though for a AWACS platform.
No.
It's stability, flying hours that are what matter.
Yeah.
And honestly, with wings that stable, yeah, folding wings absolutely would be possible.
Yeah.
And also, you've got that cabin to house the radar operators and air controllers. Because again, the Soviets will probably still be keen on fighter direction, even at sea. And in this way, you've got a way to replicate that ground station control that Russian aviators are so dependent on. But at sea.
Yeah, that's the only actual design built by Beriev that could probably fit that. Everything else they build is a lot bigger, like a lot bigger.
hey! They built something that actually works in the role we're looking at here. It's about. Let me just have a look. How big is it? Just compare it to the tracker quickly.
Wingspan is 17 meters, 59, 59, 56 feet.
So
Sorry.
that's only 5 meters wider than the E1. Oh no! Sorry. That's actually narrower than the E1's wingspan. So that's good in its favor.
Oh.
How high is it?
Height is 5.5 meters.
So that's only a little bit higher than the E1, But again, that is
Length is 15.7 meters.
yeah.
Its wing, yeah, no,
It's about the right size. It's about the right
yeah.
size. It might need some more powerful engines.
It would definitely need some more powerful engines, and it probably wouldn't be able to hold as big of
a radar. No, it wouldn't have as
radar as the E1 because of its size.
Yeah. And bear in mind, that's its height without the radar, whereas the 5.15 is with the E1's radar. So yeah, this thing is definitely not fitting in Graf Zeppelin's hangar once it's got a radar on it.
Nope. I'm just trying to think if there's something that Yakovlev developed that could have worked. Not really.
And honestly, look, the timeline fits. 1968.
The timeline fits, yeah.
Yeah, it's literally about the time that you'd want it.
Yeah. I think that's... I honestly like that. The BE-32, retrofit it.
Slightly bigger model.
Beef up the power plant.
Yeah. So that replaces the T-91. And for anti-submarine work, come on, it's obvious. Insert Kamov Design of the Year here, please.
Oh, yes.
By the late 70s. So by the time we're looking at the Kievs being laid down in 68 to 70, you're basically looking at a force, as in a flight group. So for Graf Zeppelin, you're unfortunately, it's basically you're looking at now with the airborne early warning aircraft coming in, you've got 10 fighters, 10 strike, 2 airborne early warning, and what's the word? 3 to 4 helicopters. Ukraine is slightly better.
Yep.
With Ukraine, you can probably get 15, 3 and 5, so 15 of each. Attack aircraft, fighters and bombers, and then 3 AWACS and 5 anti-submarine helicopters. And of course, for in-air refueling, honestly, you'd probably just put a buddy tank under an Su-18K, because they can probably carry a pair of buddy tanks under the wings, and that probably won't be a problem for tanking. And you've got the cats for it on both ships. Like, both ships have the 3 cats you really need to do a tanking work. And also do normal flight ops, so that's actually working quite well. I think that's why CDOT has built them that way. The man knows his stuff. Then we come to the last of the carriers up for discussion today. Which is if I can find it, I ideally want one that's just the Kievs and not anything else, if I can find it. I don't know if I have an image that is just the Kievs. I'm just going to have a look for it, because these are the last, because then these enter service in 1976, and it's a nice cut-off point for this early era of unknowns, because beyond that point, you've basically got the MiG-29 and Su-27Ks coming in. And at that point, it's basically, we know where we are. We know where we stand. It's pretty much locked in. There's no reason to change those 2 aircraft coming on stream, because they are still some of the best options. Except this time they're full Catobar aircraft rather than... And we've already got the AWACS platforms and other things lined up and ready, so... I'm looking for the Kievs. I can't find them. Where are they? Let me see if C. Dodders has them in the DMs.
So what year would these ones be entering service?
So these enter service in 1976. So literally bang on the end of the period. So all 4 of the Kievs enter service in 1976. You're looking at...
Okay.
They're not nuclear. They are conventional carriers. So...
We're not quite in MiG-29 territory yet.
No. But we're basically looking... This is the reason I want to discuss this is because this is the period where you're looking at replacing the Su-18K with a new naval
Yeah.
strike aircraft, and that's really what's up for discussion at this point. With also the possibility of replacing the airborne early warning aircraft with something equivalent to, with a much larger carrier. It might, on the old carriers, it might still be the older aircraft, but on the new carrier, you're really looking at wanting something more capable and equivalent to an E2 Hawkeye.
Yeah.
Here we go. If I can actually find it. Should be here somewhere. You have to forgive me, folks. It's a bit of a... This whole thing's a bit of a tangle, but basically, you're basically looking at a carrier that it displaces something in the region of 80,000 to 90,000 tons. So these aren't small carriers at all. This is Russia entering the super carrier game.
At long last.
But they are still a little bit behind the Americans.
But the gap is narrowing.
Yeah, the gap is in fact narrowing. You've basically ended up with... How would I describe it best? Russian Forestals, basically. No, sorry, Russian Kitty Hawks, I should say. Either or, whichever is the more modern. Come on, I can't find the sodding thing.
Would that see the argument for the Yak 41Ms?
The thing you might see basically Yak go, we were working on this design for a VTOL aircraft, but you didn't really want it. But what we can do for you is we can give you a conventional version with basically the weight of the lift engines exchanged for the ability to lug lots of anti-ship missiles.
I mean, that they could view that as an acceptable trade-off.
Yeah, since it doesn't need to be VTOL anymore because Catobar supercarrier.
Yeah, because I'm guessing with the carrier development being accelerated, I'm guessing the aircraft development would be accelerated, so we could probably push the timeline for some of the designs that were historically built forward a little bit.
There's a
like
demand,
the
there's
41,
a need.
for example.
There's a demand,
exactly.
there's a need. The Red Fleet is like with the Kievs coming in, you're looking at the what's the word? You're looking at the
41.
You're looking at there being demand requirements, that sort of thing. I found it. It's not. It's. You'll notice some similarities to another Russian carrier. Basically, our Kievs are basically straight deck Kuznetsovs. As in, they are basically Kuznetsov's sized a little bit bigger. Well, they look like Kuznetsovs, but they're not. They're not Kuznetsovs. And there are 4 of these, and they all enter service in 1976 because they're all built in parallel. The rate of construction isn't rapid, so it takes it takes 8 years from laying down to commissioning.
Yeah.
But again, these are super carriers. They're not things you build in a day.
I will say they are aesthetically pleasing on the eyes.
Yeah. It's like I think some of them complete with deck-mounted granites, but most of them are removed fairly rapidly. This is basically the Red Fleet. This is the Red Fleet toying with the idea of the missile-carrying aircraft carrier. but
Hmm.
they abandon that concept and move over to move back to their carriers just being carriers. And this is where we see the homogeny start to come in. You now have six carriers, and the Russians have 630-knot Stalingrads. I think you can see where this is going.
Yes.
Soviet carrier battle groups now consist of a Kiev and a Stalingrad. Which is actually a bit terrifying for the US. I will point out this is
Yeah.
this is a depiction of her later. So you see, like, the aircraft are slightly
Yeah.
more modern, the weapons are slightly more modern, but as commissioned, she would have looked slightly different. But yeah, so you're basically looking at something like the Yak 41 coming in. But again, it depends. If the the Yak 41 could either come in as a strike aircraft, or you could see what I discussed previously being adopted as policy. So the Yak 41 comes in as the fleet's aircraft. So you ditch the separate designations for strike and fighter, and you adopt a single airframe to do both strike and fighter roles. And at that point, you've basically then just got a single airframe across the entire fleet. Not obviously including airborne early warning and anti-submarine work, which is done by helicopters.
Okay. Yep.
So at that point, you are probably, because then that basically opens the way for the MiG-29K to come in the 1980s.
Yes.
And then the Su-27K to come in to replace that in the 1990s.
Yeah. And honestly, their entry into service is probably going to be accelerated a wee bit in this timeline compared to what we have in ours because of this.
Yeah.
Which makes me think, actually, if these things are getting developed, there probably wouldn't be much in the way of aircraft developed between the previous generation and these ones. Because if you're like these are going to be perfectly suited for these carriers. So I would think that a expedited development program for the next generation of Soviet aircraft would be initiated.
Because
you
want
probably have
the Yak 41s in service for when the Kievs commission. Oh,
yeah.
no, actually, no, sorry, even before they commission, because they've got to work up. And you want the airmen with them when they're working up.
Yes.
I do have one final image for everybody.
Yep.
Which is a bit of a... when do we go over the battleships and other ships? Those are to be covered in the full timeline stream, whenever that is. This is less about the carriers themselves and more about the aircraft they operate. But as a final capstone, as it were, and to give us something to talk about for the last 10 minutes of the discussion, allow me to show off the entire modern carrier strength of the Red Fleet at the time of the German crisis in 1991. So on the top,
just gotta wait for the inevitable delay.
So on top, you've got the aircraft carrier that is the historical Ulyanovsk that wasn't built in the Red Fleet timeline. Second from the top, you've got Ukraina. You all know her. In the middle, you've got one of the 4 Kirovs, guided missile battle cruisers, and in this case, they really do earn their title of guided missile battle cruiser.
Beautiful.
Given their 6 auto-loading 12-inch guns. You've then got the Kiev class, and finally, you've got the Red Fleet Timeline Ulyanovsk, which is a class of 4 nuclear-powered 100,000-ton supercarriers.
That slope deck
At the bottom, and that's the final endpoint of the Red Fleet's carrier development before the German crisis in 1991. So the Red Fleet, by the the outbreak of the Third World War, whoops, spoiler alert, tee has a total of well, what I can only describe, it has a fairly decent carrier fleet. You're looking at a force of 4 conventional supercarriers, Ukraine, and then you've literally just at the last second before it all kicks off, you get the 4 nuclear-driven supercarriers.
Totally not a Russian Nimitz.
Yeah, basically. But I mean, to be blunt. Oh no, sorry, not 4. It's is it 2? Is it 2 or 4? Let me have a look. Sorry, no, it's 2. The Kuznetsov's nuclear-driven supercarriers. They plan to build them in pairs over a period of 15 years, and replacing all Soviet carriers with them. Until they have 6, but of course they only get the first 2 because, well, 1991 happens.
Yeah.
So that gives it's not a Russian Nimitz. It's not a Russian Nimitz. It's a Russian supercarrier, a Russian nuke supercarrier. Like if you're building a nuclear Catobar supercarrier at a certain tonnage, you start to get a lot of look-alike syndrome going on.
What would you name it?
I just called them the Kuznetsov and Orel. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Because they take the name of the Kuznetsovs.
Fair enough.
Because the Kiev class take the name of the Kievs.
Yeah.
And the Kuznetsovs take the names that were planned for the 2 Kuznetsovs. So, Varag and Kuznetsov. But they are without a doubt the most capable carriers in the Red Fleet, and I may as well say that by the outbreak of the Second Great War, you've got a mixed their air wings in transition. So they've got a mixed bag of they've got 60 fighters, but they're a mixed bag of Su-27K and MiG-29K because the transition's still ongoing. Because they're the first to get the Su-27, so the rest of the fleet is still stuck with MiG-29K. You've got whatever form of airborne early warning aircraft. Basically, E-2 Hawkeye ski.
Okay.
It's a Russian aircraft, but it's basically, it looks like, talks like, quacks like an E-2 Hawkeye. Just the same thing. So,
yeah.
So, it's just... Whatever it is, it's equivalent. You've got you've got Kamov helicopters for anti-submarine work, and basically that's about the size of it. And again, across most of the rest of the fleet, it's basically the same, except you've got MiG-29K across most of the fleet and limited numbers on Ukraine of Yak-41s, because she's obviously the last priority to get MiG-29K, and she's still not received all of it yet. So Ukraine and Graf Zeppelin are still operating, because, well, I say operating. Graf Zeppelin is brought out of the reserves to serve in the Baltic in the Third World War. But
the poor thing.
Yeah, but Ukraine is still in the active fleet because she's still felt to be useful.
Yeah, I'm guessing GZ quickly becomes the Baltics. You said she's pulled out in the Baltic, yeah?
Yeah, because bear in mind, in the Red Fleet timeline, the Russians spend a great deal of money upgrading the links between the Baltic and the Northern Sea. So the canals that exist in the lakes. It also allows them to keep a lot of ships stored in freshwater anchorages in reserve.
Yeah. Does that mean the NATO coalition turn her into the Baltic's first artificial reef?
She's usually... So the Baltic front is... Because it's not as straightforward as it is now. Obviously, the Soviet Union still retains Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And she's kept close to St. Petersburg. She's usually operated as because the Soviets are really being careful, because it's not a war they really want to fight, but they kind of have to. So they've not invaded Sweden, they've not touched Finland, they're trying to limit the conflict as best they can, so there is a somewhat safe area that they operate in, sort of in the Gulf of Finland that way. And basically, because
Yep.
basically what Graf Zeppelin does is when she's brought back, she has a limited number of Yak 41s aboard for air defense, but she's primarily stuffed with as many Kamov helicopters as possible, and basically declares the Eastern Baltic a no submarine zone.
Oh, okay. So you're putting her down that route. I was thinking maybe she was being pulled out as like a an in situ um wartime losses training platform, I guess.
She does do training. It's partially what the Yak
Yep.
41s are there for. Um,
Yep.
but she mainly she does training a lot. But if as the war situation worsens, she does become anti-submarine flagship for the Baltic. But I mean, bear in mind when the war starts, the Red Fleet has the two nuke carriers, the four Kievs, and Ukraina. So they have a total of 7 Catobar carriers in service,
Yeah.
which is not a force to sniff at. And they've also got
Absolutely not.
and they've also got four. They've also got I think it's either 4 or 6 Kirov. I think it's 4. Yes. So the the Kirovs. There are 4 Kirovs, 6 Stalingrads. That's 10 large service combatants in active service. And they have a slightly smaller submarine fleet than we're used to in terms of nuclear submarines, and their diesel fleet is a shadow of what it is, because a lot of the money that went on maintaining and keeping a large Soviet diesel fleet has gone into the carriers and their air wings.
Oh, so that's the trade-off. Okay.
So the the Russians do have some diesel boats, but they're not as many, and they're things like The best you get is things like Foxtrots, and the things that follow the Foxtrots. The investment project that led to the Kilos hasn't been undertaken, with that money instead being diverted partially to the carriers and mostly trying to get Victor 3s in service and things like Akula.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Yep.
But of course, the Russians still have to maintain their conflict resolution assets, which are their boomers, so that's important for them as well.
Yes.
There's more money for the Red Fleet in the Red Fleet timeline than there is historically, but not an unlimited amount. So some things have had to give.
Yeah. Okay.
But with that lovely coming up on a lovely 2-hour spell, I will. This timeline is already clear. Fleet being a Rusabu and a Rustonets mean pandering the Russian Navy is not competent enough to pull this off. I feel like that's a vast overgeneralization of the Russian fleet's capabilities, given that for most of the Cold War they were considered a credible threat, and NATO treated them with the seriousness they deserve. And the Russian Navy is still a credible threat. It would be a very foolish officer in NATO navies indeed who discounted the idea of an Admiral Gorshkov or one of Russia's submarines coming to have a go at him.
Mm.
Yes, the 1981 Pushkin Tu-104 crash, that was a bunch of overconfident officers doing something incredibly stupid. Also, they were flying in a Tu-104. How daft do you have to be?
Yeah. There's a good video on that by Paper Skies, actually.
Yeah. Again, it's a Tu-104.
Highly recommend it if no one's seen it.
Yeah. Yes, the Soviet admirals did think they knew better, and it proved fatal. But they're admirals, not officers who know what a old Russian airliner is and isn't capable of. And also, it's the Soviet Union. I'm not saying this Red Fleet is perfect, and it does get its tail kicked very aggressively at certain points during the Third World War. But it's not it is a fundamentally unrealistic timeline. There are a lot of barriers that were in the way to Russia getting a carrier force in terms of political will and certain members of the Russian government, historically, that I have just basically hand-waved out of existence. But we have tried to stick to a... Like, I didn't just say the Russians are building 6 carriers every 3 years. No, we've had a sort of realistic scale-up of the fleet's carriers and what operates with them.
Yeah.
I ask people to give a little bit of disbelief, and also, it's a bit of fun. It's not... like if this was trying to be completely historically accurate, like it would have taken 5 more years and been a completely different beast than it is. Finally, though, just as a little teaser, I will just show off
Ooh.
something for the British fans in the audience. If I can find it. It should be here somewhere. Yes. So, just got a few quick images I want to flash up on the screen that Sea Dodders was kind enough to send me of a certain conflict and the ships involved in it during the Red Fleet timeline. Consider this a little bit of a spoiler, as it were.
No.
So, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a certain hullabaloo that occurs in a certain part of the world in 1981. And the Royal Navy shows up with a bunch of different task forces in Red Fleet timeline. So first things first, this is a little bit of a spoiler for you all. And it does fit since we are talking about carriers. We have Task Force Malta.
Just gotta wait for the delayed update on my end.
And this is all the ships in the task force, by the way. This isn't an abstract saying there are more ships here than there aren't. No, this is the task force and all the ships in it for this first bit. So there's the carrier task force, Task Force Malta.
Ooh.
Which has 2 Maltas, an Invincible, because the Royal Navy does build the Invincibles as anti-submarine warfare flagships. They're seen as quite useful for that. And of course, they were still considering, even in Red Fleet timeline, retiring their Catobar capability. But of course, the Falklands War proves them wrong. Then you've got the Amphibious Warfare Group and its flagship, centered around Anson.
Yep.
So that's the force that's in San Carlos Bay, blowing things up. Sandy Woodward was very happy with a 14-inch battleship as his flagship. You've then got the Royal Navy, I'm going to murder the Argentinian surface fleet with a sledgehammer, Task Force Vanguard. Which Vanguard looks very, very good. And then you've got I Wish to Blow Things Up on Land with the Naval Gunfire Support Group. And with that...
Oh, that looks great.
Yeah. And with that little peek at the Royal Navy during the Falklands War, we have come to the end of our programming. Thank you very much, Rex, for coming and helping me
pleasure.
Play this all out. It was actually really helpful, and I really enjoyed doing it, to be fair. It was a great...
We should do this again.
Yes, I mean, obviously there's the big... that may have to be split into 2 parts. The big finale of the Red Fleet timeline where everything is discussed. And all the events that have changed are discussed. But that is a fair ways off. I've got to get everyone together. And yeah, so yeah, Kirov has since been redone, but I'm working with the images that we have that I had available to me. Obviously, when we do the Red Fleet timeline properly, we'll have Sea Dodders with all the images available, and everything will be tip top. But I hope you've all enjoyed. I hope you will tune in on Monday for Ramblings, as usual. Thank you, Rex, for coming. For those of you who are in the Discord server of the Dry Dock, please do tune in for game night later on. Take care, folks. Thank you, Rex. And I will catch you all
Good.
on